Gone.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Kobza, and I am the Vice President for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. I appreciate all of you attending this evening. I think a lot of you have probably frequented our events previously. So this evening, we'll be discussing the Interwar Wargaming period at the Naval War College, presented by Pete Pellegrino. Before he gets started, just a quick procedural note. Just request that everybody keep their cameras off and their voices muted to preserve bandwidth as much as possible. Additionally, this event, like all of our events, will be recorded and put up on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you want to share this event with somebody else or maybe miss part of it, feel free to check it out on our YouTube channel. I'll be sure to paste that into our chat box here at the end of the webinar. And then finally, for questions and answers, at the end or after Pete's presentation, we will have a Q&A period. However, for our format, I would ask that instead of unmuting yourself and asking the questions yourself, simply type the questions into the chat box, and then I will ask those to Pete, and he'll answer them, just to keep things a little more orderly and not get too many wires crossed. So with that, we will shift over to tonight's presentation. Pete Pellegrino is a retired naval commander and game designer with Valiant Integrated Services, supporting the US Naval War College as lead for war game design and adjudication since 2004. Along with professional war games, Pete has provided business war games for Fortune 500 companies, consults for major toy and game companies, and conducts historical simulations and wargame events for civic groups, universities, and high schools through Tabletop History, LLC. And with that, Pete, I will turn it over to you and take it away.
Okay. Again, welcome, everybody. So tonight, what I'm going to try to plow into is looking at the interwar period, but I want to put it in kind of the broader context, because the interwar period is kind of this halcyon period. It's sort of like if you want to invoke the gods of wargaming past, you summon them from the interwar period. And War Plan Orange and the War College and the interwar period gaming have become synonymous. When I hope tonight you can see that if we're talking about War Plan Orange, we're actually talking about a kind of a larger span of time and history. And understanding what the War College did and didn't do in that time period, and the ecosystem, I'll call it, that the War College lived within that made it effective is an important part of understanding then what lessons can we learn in terms of wargaming today. So with that kind of that warm up, what I'm going to start you off with is some archival footage. Right, so if you've got volume, make sure your volume's turned on. Hopefully the volume comes through on your end. We've got a film clip from Victory at Sea. And if you remember, Victory at Sea was that the documentary style World War II television dramas kind of thing that I think fits this period and kind of gives you the feel for how War Plan Orange and the War College were knit together. So with that, we'll go ahead and start this. Okay, so as that suggests, that's not, while that might be the popular story, that's not quite the way it worked out. Funny, I had someone contact me actually trying to find this footage on Victory at Sea, and this is something that obviously I put together to make the point. So the context of this mythological period and the interwar period, in part, is kind of reinforced by Admiral Nimitz, and everyone wants to quote this piece here at the top about the war with Japan. All right, and they tend to focus on this part about there was nothing that was a surprise. And what exactly do you mean by, so everything was predicted? And not so much so. And people also mix up the two in terms of, Nimitz spoke at the college on two different occasions in 60 and 61 to the student body in Spruance Hall. And also, he expressed similar sentiments in a letter that he wrote to the president of Naval War College in 1965. And perhaps in some ways, the letter is a little better in terms of communicating what I think he meant. And you can listen to this talk, the October 10th talk. We've got it in our digital archives as part of the Gray Book, the entire papers of Chester Nimitz. And it's at the 19-minute and 40-second mark that he makes this comment. So what's instructive is understand what he was talking about when he made the comment. And he was talking about basically the value of military education, professional military education. And he's reflecting on his time at the War College. The Nimitz is class of 23. Okay, we'll talk more about the significance of the fact that he's class of 23. And this idea here, though, that when he means surprise, or people latch on surprise, rather than perhaps the words I've got highlighted here in terms of by so many people, so many different ways. And I hope you'll come to see it here at the end of this talk or so. It's about 45 minutes or so. That it's more about the people who were gaming than necessarily what the games themselves were quote unquote saying. So this mythos of the period, I liken this to the American holiday of Thanksgiving. Right? We have a popular cultural image of Thanksgiving. Right, and it tends to be about pilgrims and the black hats and the white buckle or the buckle type of thing and the Puritans and this is lovely dinner with the Wampanoag Indians and someone brought a turkey. All right. Whereas being here in Rhode Island, we are at ground zero for King Philip's War. The actual history of the first couple of years of the Mayflower colony is a brutal history. Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Mayflower, is an excellent read if you want to learn about the early Plymouth colonies and the war that broke out that nearly wiped out both sides in terms of the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. So it's a very sloppy, brutal period. A lot of the fighting centered right here in Rhode Island, and yet we've got this warm, fuzzy feeling with Thanksgiving. Now, Thanksgiving from that mythological perspective helps to know the history, but it doesn't diminish the value of myth. Myth has its value. All right, there's a reason that when I was a young school kid, we learned about the American mythos, the legends of American history. Paul Bunyan, right? Pecos Bill. All right, so nobody really thinks that Paul Bunyan dragging his axe created the Grand Canyon, or that Babe the Blue Ox, when his feet got stuck in the mud, created the Great Lakes. So why are those sort of legendary figures important? Why is myth and things like Thanksgiving important? Because in part, it captures who we want to be. It reflects the American character and perhaps what we strive to be and those ideals. It forms an important part of our identity. Likewise, the interwar period in wargaming and warplane orange form an important part of the Naval War College's identity. Yeah, a lot of myth mixed in there, but important nonetheless. But just as it helps to appreciate the value of the Thanksgiving holiday when you understand the history, tonight let's see if we can unpack the Thanksgiving history that goes around the interwar period and the War College. So the period here in terms of, or I should say, how to think about warplane orange. Think of it as like a strand of DNA. So what we have here is kind of the entire warplane orange thinking from its inception through the final portions of it and the years that each part was resolved, so to speak. So first, terminology. This story usually comes down to this contest between the people who thought we were going to shoot across the Pacific Ocean, lickety split, the thrusters, who we were going to do a quick thrust across the Pacific, versus the cautionaries, who recommended the stepping stone approach, the island hopping approach, basically. And it's important to realize that unlike what my little fake victory at sea suggested at the beginning, that somehow the thrusting across the Pacific was rapidly dismissed out of hand as being impractical, and then we settled down to working out the details of island hopping. It's like, no. If you look, and I try to use the colors consistently throughout this talk, that when you see our burnt umber, or whatever we want to call this color here, this will always refer to thrusting thinking, the thinking that we can push our way across the Pacific relatively quickly. And this yellowy color, ochre color, will be for the people who are thinking more a stepped approach. Now, understand certain things that are in common, and this is an important one right here. Okay, this idea that either approach was going to end in a grand Mahanian naval battle. It was going to be this massive fleet action, and the winner, presumably the United States, having swept the Imperial Japanese Navy from the sea, was then free to move on to later phases of the plan, which would force the capitulation of Japan. So this was really just a matter of where and when this giant naval battle was going to happen. But everybody thought that's what was going to happen. We're working our way towards a major battle. So War Plan Orange itself breaks into 3 chunks. Okay, phase 1 of the original thinking around the war plan starts about 1906, and we'll look at a timeline about why 1906. But in phase 1, the idea is we have to secure the western coast of the United States, Hawaii to California, the eastern Pacific. Right? We need to ensure that that is quote unquote secure. Then we can think about, that's kind of like the defensive stage. Then we can think about the transitory stage where we get over and somewhere, probably west of Hawaii, we'll encounter the Imperial Japanese Navy and we'll have this grand battle. Phase 1, the broad strokes of phase 1 are worked out pretty quickly. Why? Because as we start to figure out that Japan is a long ways from California, California is a long ways from Japan. So the difficulty that the Japanese are going to have in mounting a major offensive operation against the west coast of the United States, Hawaii, yeah, maybe. California, really hard. And just in terms of the distance, logistics, et cetera. So there's that part of the plan settles down pretty quickly. And by about 1912, we were kind of not talking about that part of the plan. Likewise, phase 3. So phase 3 is the idea that having defeated the Imperial Japanese Navy, now what we're going to do is force Japan to capitulate. How are we going to do that exactly? Are we just going to try to do blockade? The Japanese home islands are really big. It's a lot of sea if you're going to try to blockade to force them into submission. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth about how exactly, having defeated the Japanese Navy, are we now able to use the seas to force Japan to capitulate? And the reason it starts to kind of settle down in 1929 is basically we start to demonstrate the efficacy of air power. Okay? And that's kind of like the aha. Okay. So the Navy can blockade, and then we can use bombers that are now being able to carry a decent ordnance load, a sizable distance. We'll bomb them and just suing for peace. So phase 3, how are we going to win after defeating the Japanese Navy? That's in the can by, again, 1929. So it's this sloppy middle part, this phase 2 of how do we get there, that we argue for the length of War Plan Orange's operational history, so to speak. All right, so you can see that, again, colors matter here. So our thrusters, and you can see that in the life of this plan, thrusting is the dominant plan. The dominant strategy is thrusting. Not like, oh, it was dismissed early on and then it's under the cautionaries. You can see the cautionaries have their moment in 22 and not again until 34. We'll talk about why. Okay. There's another camp we do need to mention, and there's these folks over here, the dark brown folks, what I'll call the Western Arsenal folks, or the Pacific Gibraltar. And this was a thinking that great nations, great sea power nations, have overseas bases. Look at Great Britain. Okay, from South Africa, Singapore, Hong Kong. The part of the reason that they are a global power is because they have global bases. So in dealing with Japan, why don't we just have our own Gibraltar? If Gibraltar is the hub from which the United Kingdom would be able to dominate the Mediterranean, then how come we don't have a hub in the Western Pacific from which we can dominate Japan should the need arise? So this is the Western Arsenal thinking, okay? And we'll talk about why they drop off in favor in 22. All right, so it's in 34. Finally, the cautionaries kind of are the dominant thinking. There's a resurgence of the Western Arsenal people ever so briefly, but then we're into the rainbow plans, and we'll talk about those here in a bit. But so you can see already, it's not this clean timeline of, yep, we're thinking about war with Japan. Nope, can't scoot across the Pacific, so let's go island hopping. It's a little more complicated than that. And it really depends on personalities to a great extent, and the institutions and advances in technology and changes in geopolitics that shape the strategy over the time period. So let's talk about the people involved. Because one of the things that I ran into is this idea that somehow the thrusters were foolish. I mean, come on, have you seen how big the Pacific is? Do they not have a map? And to think that they could get across that in any type of timely fashion in order to wage war with Japan, these can't be the brightest of strategists. Well, these are the people I would put in the thrusting category. All right, Dewey, the hero of the Spanish-American War, he's the first chair of the General Board of the Army-Navy Combined Board. Remember Dewey's experience, right? That war runs an afternoon. Okay, Manila Bay, Santiago, that quick, decisive action is what the country expects from its Navy, right? Mahan, president of the War College in 1886, and again, the author of The Influence of Sea Power on History, and that navies are meant to take the fight to the enemy. It is meant to be an offensive tool, right? So again, very much so of that if we're not moving out, if we're not exerting power or distance, then we're not using navies for what navies were made for. King, class of 33, along with Bull Halsey, class of 33. And we're going to talk about the class of 33 in detail here in a bit. But these are folks who, in their earlier writings and their general thinking and some of the comments they've made, tends to put them into a thrusting camp. Now, does it mean that they specifically adhere to a zip across the Pacific? No, but understand that it's not as simple as that. So if these are the personalities which are of a thrusty nature, then who are the cautionaries? Right, well, the cautionaries, again, luminaries of naval history, particularly World War II. Right? Nimitz, class of 23, we already mentioned. Spruance, class of 27, later became president of the Naval War College. Forrest Sherman, Turner. These are folks that all are taking, when they look at the problem, and particularly when they do their writing at the War College, everyone had to write the tactical paper, often based on their experience in one of the war games. And you see in some of the ratings about tactics and problems in the Pacific, where you can kind of see those inklings of seeing the necessity of securing islands, and especially as air power starts to influence the thinking and submarines start to influence the thinking about what we could do going across the Pacific. And so these are kind of our cautionary folks. So again, there are luminaries on both sides of this argument. So one of the first things I want to disabuse people of is that somehow that the thrusters didn't know what they were talking about. It's like, well, good heavens now, we got King here, all right? So to put all of this in its broader history, okay, I kind of put together this, and much of this comes from Ed Miller's book, War Plan Orange, okay? So what I've done here is I've tried to create a couple of different bands of information. So what we're looking at from about 1907 through 42, this top layer is geopolitics. Okay, it's kind of what's going on in the world writ large in terms of war and other conflicts. Next line down, technology, because technology will shape some of the strategic thinking. Institutions, how we're organized does influence how we see problems. The individual people involved. Right? Again, you just saw 8 individuals back there. And again, who's in what position? Who's in the chair? Who's the CNO is going to influence the popularity in the bottom. This is my who's the popular kids plotting here, okay? So in this bottom section, if you're up at the top, if you're up here towards this end of the scale, okay, you're the cool kids. Your thinking is in the mainstream. Your strategy is dominant. Again, you get to sit with the cool kids at lunch. If you're down here, you're eating by yourself. Okay, your strategy is out of favor if you're at the bottom of this plot. So as we said before, orange, brown, and ochre are our relevant colors. And there's a couple of benchmark moments that we'll talk about here. Right here, as we go into World War I, the Washington Naval Treaty of 22, and then as we move into the beginning of World War II. So let's kind of start in the beginning. And you notice that in the beginning, there is no cautionary story, all right? It's all about either Western arsenal thinking, Gibraltar of the West for the United States. Remember, we've won the Spanish-American War. We've got the Philippines. Woohoo! We've got a place to base out of that. If we want to have our own Gibraltar, Hong Kong, Singapore, we can do it in the Philippines. So it's a matter, that's why Luzon is on there in terms of the thrusty groups, is well, they'll fight the fight and we're gonna zip across and we're gonna back them up. Also remember what's happened in terms of why are we thinking we can zip across, right? The Great White Fleet has completed its journey around the world, and the visual of the Great White Fleet, the United States' naval power, the ships sailing around the world. Granted, by the time the ships came back, many of them were technologically obsolete and were in rough shape. Didn't matter. The visual, right, is reinforcing a Dewey view of the world, a Mahan view of the world. Okay, and why even worry about Japan? Well, first off, remember Japan has defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Roosevelt helps to negotiate the peace, gets a Nobel Peace Prize out of it, right? So there's a little bit of, what about those Japanese, okay? And there's this piece here that we have an immigration scare, all right? And again, this has to do with labor flooding into the West Coast. The United States is expanding industrially. And this is eventually resolved diplomatically. However, it does set the military side of the house kind of up on edge to go, maybe we should really be thinking about, we need to add Japan to the list of potential adversaries that we think about and plan against. All right. So we've got we have a naval board. It's the joint board by throwing in the Army with it there. And the War College, along with the joint board, does some early war plan orange planning. Now understand, in the early days, the general board and the Navy, for that matter, doesn't have a huge staff. There's no CNO yet. There's no OPNet. So who's doing this planning? Well, actually, there's about 6-8 professors in their spare time are doing this at the War College. The War College is, again, relatively small at this point, founded in 1884. Right? It's been growing. And so there's a pretty collegial relationship between the general board and the War College. Between the general board and the War College. And everything goes along fine here in the beginning. Again, both thinking that maybe we can, fight out of Luzon, we're already there, then maybe Guam, but the thrusters are good over here. And then along comes the War College going, hey, we're looking at this, and we're thinking, maybe that's not the approach. Maybe what we really need is a slower, more methodical approach across the Pacific. The Pacific is large. Where we use any of the Central or Southern Pacific islands as way stations going across. And and having read both John Hattendorf's version of this event and Ed Miller's, I've got this visual of the board sitting around one day, a lazy afternoon, and the War College is there, and the president of the War College is presenting. And when he finishes, there's stunned silence in the room. This is not what Dewey wants to hear. What they're proposing is slow. This is not thrusty. This is not bold. This is not what the American people expect of the Navy. And so apparently the president of the Naval War College gets a bit of a tongue lashing for the board. And he goes, oh, hang on. Okay, all right, hang on. Perhaps we can relook at this. But you need to understand, I only have a small group of officers who can work on this stuff. They're supposed to be teaching. That's their day job, is teaching. So if you really want us to be more involved in these planning activities, and we need help. I need more members. I need more faculty members to be able to take on some of this dedicated planning effort. Otherwise, I don't see how I can do it. I'm happy to do it, but you're going to have to resource me more. And I don't know if he was trying to call a bluff, because the board basically says, thank you for your interest in national security. Your services are no longer required. And the War College is told, you go and knock yourself out with the curriculum. You educate naval officers. You don't get involved with planning anymore. And they are disinvited from further participation in planning. Okay. So already this preeminent role of the War College in the planning is sort of starting to fall apart in the very early days. So we wallow down here. Okay, but then what happens? Okay, World War I. Okay, World War I is significant for a couple of reasons. Okay, probably one of the biggest factors that helps out the island hopping is this German Micronesia. Japan, as a result of World War I, acquires German Micronesia. Remember early on when they said we're going to hop across the Pacific? They're going to go, wait, okay, law of armed conflict, laws of neutrality. Okay, you can't just arbitrarily use other countries' islands on your way to Japan. There's rules against that. So unless they're Japanese islands, then there are no islands that we can count on, because remember, all of these plans, all of the color plans, War Plan Red, Great Britain, War Plan Orange, Japanese, War Plan Black, Germany, are all just unilateral, US alone fighting another country. That's it. They assume no allies. So if we have no allies, we have to respect neutrality. If we're respecting neutrality, we can't be using a lot of these islands that don't belong to either one of us. They don't belong to us. They don't belong to the Japanese. Therefore, they're kind of off limits from the law of armed conflict perspective. But now Japan owns Micronesia. Oh, this increases the credibility of this plan. And this is why you start to see this upswing, okay, around this time period. The other thing that starts, though, to reinforce this notion of maybe a more stepwise approach where we kind of stop and pause at each of these islands is basically what's happening in the technology side with aviation and submarines. Nothing like war to pick up the pace of technology. All right. So going into World War I, I'd offer that submarines go down more often than they come up. Airplanes, we're not really sure what they're good for, other than scouting and trying to shoot at each other, maybe throwing a hand grenade over the side. But as carriage weights, ordnance, range, performance of both platforms, reliability is increasing. These are becoming a bit of an asymmetric threat to navies, because at this point, the thinking around a navy is the biggest threat to a battleship is another battleship. Okay, this is Dreadnought V Dreadnought time. Okay, this is where it's all about weight of throw, thickness of armor. Right? That's what this is about. So these weapons, airplanes, submarines, they start to pose a bit of a threat to this race across. And we'll talk about how that manifests in college gaming here in a bit. OPNAV has stood up. So in theory now, again, there's a little bit more staff that can deal with this planning part of it. And again, further reducing the right here, GG planning all to the War College. By the way, the Joint Board does get suspended. They irritate Wilson because, like good military officers, they're planning to get involved in World War I and making plans for it. Wilson is adamant about staying out of the war. He thinks this is not quite treasonous, but his senior military officers are not abiding by his wishes. So he actually suspends the board. Benson, our first CNO, and Benson is personality-wise not dissimilar to a Nimitz, a Spruance, a Turner. He tends to be much more of a cautionary. So the cautionary people, and by the way, the other thing you want to notice down here is this gray line that talks about how long people think a conflict with Japan will last. And early on, we're thinking Spanish-American War Part 2. Quickie, over in an afternoon. Okay. And then as time marches on, they're increasingly, the estimates start saying things like, well, it's a year. It's 2 years. It's more than 3 years. And that kind of tracks along with the thinking in terms of the dominant strategy of the cautionary approach. All right. So after the war, the Washington Naval Treaty, right, basically does in the Gibraltar folks. Why? One of the bargaining chips that we put on the table is that we won't fortify west of the international date line. Remember, we're now in a position where we're all trying to barter. There's this bargaining process where we're trying to set ratios for ship tonnage and types between the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. And Japan's kind of irritated that they're coming out in the short end of these ratios. So one of the things that we throw on the table to try to get them to go along with this is that we won't fortify west of the date line, which puts this whole create our own Gibraltar in the Philippines out of the question. That pretty much so kills thinking around that, this idea that we're going to base out there. There's other discussions about, trying to use Guam and its suitability for this type of thing. And by and large, you don't hear a whole lot of talk about we're going to fortify and have some sort of permanent large scale presence from which we're going to fight Japan after about 22 or so, 1922. All right. There's a brief moment. These stars are when we actually have something that looks like a signed war plan. Right. And with Benson in there, we actually, again, with the islands, the threat that we're starting to see, we have our first carrier, right, out there. These are all things that are supporting this idea that we need to be mindful of the role that aviation is going to have in the next war. Okay, and here we have a ship sunk by aircraft in testing. Again, unheard of that a plane is going to be able to bomb a ship and then we're not just going to pound it with another ship. Okay, we have a war plans division. Again, so somewhere in here, there's this rapprochement between the War College and OPNAV. There's a little bit of a kiss and make up. All right, whereas we were told to go away back after we proposed this whole cautionary thing. Now the cautionary is kind of cool. It's on the rise in popularity, and some of these other plans are looking a little shaky. The War College is a little bit more involved again, especially because of the Washington Naval Treaty and some of the limitations. We're experimenting with some crazy hull ideas to get around some of these tonnage limits. Can we take the back end of an aircraft carrier and have the front end of a cruiser, and how would that work? So Norm Friedman writes in To Win a Future War, some kind of quasi-testing, if you will, of some of these hull types. And what the War College was asked, and I don't know if these were purely staff exercises, so to speak, in terms of the staff got together and thought about this stuff, or how much of this stuff actually then was thrown onto the wargaming floor to think through the utility of some of these platforms. But basically what we were doing was we were looking at our rules, all right, and we would say, well, if it's about this big and it's got this beam and this length, then we'll say that it probably has a speed and maneuver performance not dissimilar to a cruiser. So we'll use the cruiser rules for maneuver speed, but it's up armored a bit. So we'll borrow some of the rules from battleships. We'll throw in a half a rule, and we kind of just cobbled together some combat result tables and rules based on whatever Frankenship the Navy was thinking about. And then we would feed our either, again, just the staff's opinion, or and putting that thing on the floor, giving the students an opportunity to play around with it. What was their feedback in terms of we found utility, we didn't find utility in this thing you're sticking on the floor, and how that then influenced ship innovation downstream. Again, more about the ecosystem the college is living here in a bit. All right, but nobody gets to stay popular forever here. All right, and we have some changes. Rear Admiral Kuntz comes in as CNO. Kuntz is a thruster. All right, you get people like the Governor General Wood, who is very much so pro-Philippines, is Regional Governor of, and he wants to see a plan which will rapidly reinforce the Philippines. That's his personal preference, how he's thinking about it. Blackjack Pershing takes over the General Board. Right, Blackjack Pershing, not the kind of guy who's going to want to take a very slow, stepwise approach to anything. Right, so suddenly there's kind of a change in personalities here that start to push our cautionaries down, and we kind of bump along with the thrusters still kind of being the cool kids again. Now, finally, let's talk about the War College right in here. So here's the War College. What's going on in this period? War College games show an increasing through ticket attrition. The through ticket, the thruster, the plan, is also referred to as a through ticket plan. One of the problems was what these guys, these aircraft and submarines, were doing to this in terms of attrition. So we might start the war game. So we'd be doing, and we'll talk about the different kinds of war games that are played at the college. One of them was the strategic or operational or chart maneuver one, where it's really about crossing great distances, not the details of a fleet on fleet action, but just how do I get from point A to point B? All right, and they would start with a dozen battleships out of Pearl would start west, trying to get to the waters, the Phil Sea of Japan, and they'd play through. And as you'd expect, as you're going along, you start running into the adversary who's out. He's got forces forward, and there's attrition. And so they kind of play through, and you start with 12, and you get 10 through. Well, that's pretty good. I only lost 2 guys. You start with 12, and you get 8 through. That's not so stellar. And the ones that get through are beat to hell, and they're going to need some time. Probably in the Philippines to rest and repair and restore. You start with 12 and you get 6 through. You've taken 50% attrition. These are numbers that we can't ignore. And what's eating them up? Planes and submarines operating from island bases are beginning to eat up the fleet. And this is a difficult thing to get around. This attrition, which is occurring in a mid-ocean fight. So it further drives, and you can see here as the War College is doing this, and it's not like we're printing tons of papers and driving this through a policy perspective. We'll show you how this kind of gets out there and starts influencing fleet thinking, but it's a much more gradual rise in popularity of this stepwise approach because of things like mid-ocean attrition. Now, one of the things that people used to throw out there about this thing, at least my earliest impressions I started looking into the time period, was that it was the logistics. The Pacific is huge. We couldn't get across. Coaling, good grief. You ever try to do coaling at sea and it's terrible. And we never get there. Okay, we're done coaling. right, in 22. The last coal-fired ship is converted to oil, fuel oil, greater energy density, easier to refuel at sea. And we're pretty much so working on this refueling at sea thing. All right. So that's not a barrier in so much so as that's what was compelling a more cautionary step. No, it's more about mid-ocean attrition and how do we use our own aircraft? How do we use our own submarines operating from islands, so like stationary aircraft carriers, to put an air bubble or a protective air envelope so the fleet can move through that, being protected from more shore-based air until we can get to the next set of islands and create the next umbrella and move under it. Right? It's not coal. That's not really the problem at the point. So as time now, after we get it past here, you can see that most of the individuals, most of the events that are occurring after about 32 or so are all yellow. They all tend to reinforce this strategy of the cautionary approach. And it's basically, we'll talk about both CNO Stark and Stanley. Stanley's a graduate from the class of 21. He's a CNO that basically signs another plan that reflects this type of cautionary approach. Right now, remember I said, oh, by the way, this is huge up here too. This PBYs are introduced. Okay, so if you remember the writings of Captain Wayne Hughes from the Naval Postgraduate School, passed away here not too long ago. He who fires first effectively wins. Well, to fire first, you have to find them first. When it was gun on gun, right, it's a horizon problem. Okay, so it's going to be more about positioning because we're going to see each other about the same time. Right, when it's just kind of dreadnoughts driving around, folks up in the masts, and we're looking for smoke on the horizon to figure out where the enemy is. And if I can see him, good chances he can see me. So then it becomes about who is able to rapidly position their ship to be in a position of advantage to bring the most number of guns to bear. Ooh, but now if we're flying around in airplanes, we're much further apart. And if airplanes are carrying any ordnance, they become this asymmetric threat. You can have the most powerful battle line in the world, but if you can't find the adversary's aircraft carrier where he's starting to spit out ships armed with armor-piercing bombs, then you don't want to be found. We need to solve the scouting problem. Scouting is huge in this time period in terms of being able to be the one who inflicts the first blow. PBYs are an awesome scouting platform. So again, this further reinforces the role of aviation and the power of aviation to inflict mid-ocean attrition. When we get into Japan now, this is the not if there's a war with Japan, it's when there's a war with Japan. Storm clouds are gathering at this point. Japan is going to attack China. All right, and obviously Germany has invaded Poland. And at that point, we'd have a major shift here. Now, one thing before I leave this part, never say anything is dead. Remember I said the Western Arsenal people were dead? Yeah, well, not really. All right, MacArthur momentarily tries to resurrect this the defense of the Philippines and defense of Guam. And the Navy kind of sells a plan, the Royal Road, which is this relief across, effort across the Pacific to relieve Corregidor should the Philippines be invested, because they're awful close. You notice that this line up here about Luzon becomes Mindanao. This idea that why are we thinking that if we do cross the Pacific so quickly, we're gonna have to go further south in the Philippine archipelago? Because Japan's aircraft can range you. So you don't want to be in range of shore-based air coming out of Japan while you're trying to repair the battleships that you just fought your way across. So people start looking for other places to go, which is further weakening this plan about zipping across, right? And again, in 34, we pretty much have Stanley signing a plan that says, stop it. We're not talking about this through ticket thing anymore. We're going to be solidly wed to this approach here. And then we bump into the beginning of World War II. And what's significant about Germany invading Poland is suddenly the United States realizes, oh, these whole, it's us against Japan, it's us against Germany, and that's it. There's going to be a coalition. There's going to be allies involved. There's going to be multiple countries on both sides. This is going to be a global conflict. All right. And so we go from all the different color plans to putting all the colors together in the color of the rainbow. That's why they're called the rainbow plans. All right. And we end up with rainbows initially 1 through 5. And how the Navy fits into the rainbow plans, given that we spent all this time thinking about war with Japan in the Pacific. And by the way, no one ever talks about War Plan Black. What an awesome success War Plan Black was. War Plan Black was for Germany. The War Plan Black had us fighting Germany in the Caribbean. Okay, so everyone looks like Warplane Orange and goes high fives about how Warplane Orange, oh my gosh, we predicted the war in the Pacific, and that's how it worked out with Japan. And we don't talk about things like Warplane Black, right? Because that's not the way the Battle of the Atlantic unfolded. So we tend to kind of we're cherry picking which ones we want to sing the praises of, and we'll look at which countries we're gamed against and what to grant here in a few minutes. But I want to talk about a little about the rainbow plans just briefly, because it does kind of shape into how the Navy then starts to move into the Warplane Orange getting formalized. And Admiral Stark, he's the CNO, and this is it was called the Plan Dog Memorandum, right? And basically he says, look, as we're now looking at potentially a war on two coasts, what we're going to have to do is think about our options. And essentially what we have is the ability to we're either going to go to defensive on both the Atlantic and Pacific sides. And so that's plan able. Okay, we're going to kind of do a defensive hold on the Atlantic while we go offensive in the Pacific. That's Baker. We're going to hold in the Pacific and go offensive in the Atlantic, Dog. And then I kind of went around the other way. And Charlie, we're going to go offense on both sides. All right, so Charlie's almost dead on arrival, right? Because we don't have the Navy at the outset to be able to sustain major offensive operations on both coasts, or from both coasts, for two different theaters. All right, so Charlie's kind of dead. And so ultimately, where Stark leans, and this is what becomes the Europe First plan, is Plan Dog, okay, or the Dog plan. And this fits within the Rainbow plans. And at the first Rainbow, Rainbow One tends to be the defense of the Northern Hemisphere kind of thing. And we're assumed not to have allies in Rainbow One. The Army drafts Rainbow One. So it's very defensive, CONUS-based kind of thinking. Rainbows 2 and 3 are more or less variations on Warplan Orange, okay? Some people have said, yeah, it's the worst bits of Warplan Orange in terms of fighting in the Pacific. But we would be allied with France and the United Kingdom in that plan. It was drafted by the Navy. And a lot of the thinking around Rainbows 2 and 3 are influenced by kind of all the experience of gaming and thinking about war with Japan in the Pacific. Rainbow 4 is more or less the same as Rainbow 1. It changes the scope of the defensive perimeter for the Western Hemisphere. And so ultimately then Rainbow 5 is what gets settled on, and that's the Europe First strategy. And we're going to basically hold in the Pacific. We'll start with the Atlantic, and then we'll deal with Japan when we can. But deep in all of these plans, if you're talking to the Navy, right, the Navy always sees this in the context of Warplan Orange, because it's what we've been gaming and thinking about and working for so much time. So that's always kind of in the back of people's minds is, yeah, but what about Warplan Orange? In terms of how we thought about dealing with the Pacific. So at this point, let's kind of recap in terms of what, the myths here. That myth number one was that the War College drafted the strategy in the interport years. This is, no, we did not draft the strategy. We did not own the strategy. Okay, remember after 1911, we're excluded from official strategy writing. Yes, we do have a relationship later. We reestablished that the War Plans Division and OPNAV have their own war planning capacity, but they're the one who owned the plans. That the college was constantly just working on Warplan Orange. It's like, no, not really. We didn't own any war plans at the college. Okay, OPNAV owned the war plans. In that period, we basically, at the college, we played 318 games of either strategic, it was called the strategic, the chart maneuver or operational games versus the tactical games. But the adversaries in those games, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, Great Britain, good grief, it was all part of the curriculum. Student and faculty papers on various topics were kind of forwarded up to OPNAV and through the general board for consideration when President of the Naval War College thought that, Commander Nimitz had an interesting paper that thought it would be of interest to the general board, so the paper would be submitted. But there's no formalized relationship that has the War College formally working on the plans. Yeah, there's another department for that. The island hopping part was introduced in the Warrior as well, ish, okay? It was conceived very early on, but as I said, without the islands to hop to, there was a problem, and it was too slow militarily. The Dewey, Mahan, again, the recent experience pre-World War I is that naval wars are quick things, and we just keep looking at the last war we fought, we keep looking at the Spanish-American War and see how brilliant that went. Right, so these early discussions about island hopping are just politically untenable, right? And this idea that the through ticket died because of logistics, it's like, no, not really. It was more about Stanley finally killing it in 34 due to the fact that he could not see how we could, without taking a more stepped approach and establishing our own air umbrellas on these islands, could we get around the problem that the Japanese would be posing with their air umbrellas around the islands and us having to sail through them. Okay, so that's some of the first kind of things that we got knocked to the side. But now I want to look at really just, so what was going on at the college? That's the broader context of Warplane Orange, but Warplane Orange and the college are not synonymous. Wargaming wasn't for the purposes of Warplane Orange. So let's just look at the time period. All right, so 1919, 1941 here in this example, you can see this is the gaming activity. So if it's orange, it has to do with Japan. If it's red, it has to do with Britain. If it's black, it has to do with Germany. If it's solid, we're talking about a tactical game. If it's kind of hash marked, then we're talking about a strategic level or our ops level games. Okay? So in this time period, we're looking at the 318 games I mentioned earlier. So 318 games. But let's look at a particular year. So let's look at the class of 33. So started in 1932, graduated in 33. We're going to use that class as kind of an exemplar of what was going on in terms of the curriculum and how wargaming was done in that time period. So the curriculum in that period, calendar days, from welcome aboard to graduation was 332 calendar days. All right, 332 calendar days. Now, when you subtract out Sundays and Christmas, you have 271 instructional days. That's important to note here. Okay, instructional days were Monday to Saturday. And the only holiday really observed was Christmas. You got 10 days off, okay, between Christmas and New Year's. Otherwise, play on, okay? We use Saturday. You want a reading day? That's Sunday after chapel, okay? So it's a much more intense curriculum. So 271 instructional days. Of the 271 instructional days, 245 of those days, you are either preparing for a war game and doing your commander's estimate of the situation, playing the war game, or doing post-game critique and post-game study. So that represents 90%, 90.4% of the curriculum is tied in with gaming. Gaming is the curriculum. It's the way the course is taught. So let's look at that class of 33 and just see what were they gaming about, right? Both strategy and tactics. Here are some of the topics that would have been either gamed or were in specific presentations. From the strategic perspective, there's the Pacific Northern route was often studied. Can we go that way, skirting along the Aleutians and get Japan that way? The defense of Hawaii is often looked at, obvious reasons. Panama, the canal, because it's a link obviously between the coasts, the Western Pacific. All of these are looked at as how do we get there from here type of problems. Then in the tactical side of the house, it's night maneuvers, landing operations, mines, battle line, raiders. All these topics are topics of gameplay. So looking at, let's pull apart this class here, and let's break it down a little bit. So commencement, or I'm sorry, welcome aboard. The class started the 1st of July, 1932. Okay, the class of 32 or class of 33. Remember, this is the King's class. This is Halsey's class. All right. Early in the curriculum, and now this is not necessarily a chronology of the way events. It kind of sort of is, but the games were a little more interleaved, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But early on the course, there was 12 days were dedicated to tactical presentations. These were just kind of a review. Remember, I've got a mixed group. I've got aviators. I've got not a ton of aviators at the time, but I got aviators. I've got surface warfare officers. I've got submariners. So there's kind of a general review of lectures and some exercises on basic tactics for the different communities, right? 12 days. Then, also very early on in the course, 4 days were dedicated to search problems. I've already emphasized the importance of searching and finding the adversary. So this is where they kind of go over and say, okay, so as a refresher, reminder, because these tend to be commanders and captains, some lieutenant commanders, that what we're looking at here are spanning square search patterns, radial search patterns. How is it that we do search? 4 days dedicated to reviewing your search tactics. Okay. Now we've got to learn how to play the game. Okay? You're going to be using this game all year, so we've got to teach you how to play our floor game. All right. So there are 21 days dedicated to demonstrating both how to use the models, the maneuver rules, orders writing, everything that goes into quote unquote playing the game. 21 days are spent on that. Then there's a real quickie 3 days of how to do the chart or operational level games. And so here it is, in about the first month of instruction, month long, all right, we're getting ready to play. And this is one of the things I contrast against how we do games now. It's not dissimilar. I feel like that we invite people to play Axis and Allies, and we sit down, and the precious time we have before we start a war game, we'll go through. First, we got to tell you, where the bathrooms are and where the head and what to do if the building catches on fire and that type of thing. All right, and then we're going to spend a bunch of time telling you how we got to the conflict. All right, and I liken this to saying, okay, let's sit down and play Axis and Allies. We're going to spend about a half hour going over the history from the end of World War I up through the beginning of World War II. So you have some background in World War II and how we got to this point. We're going to play this game about World War II, and I think we're ready to play now. I haven't talked about the rules at all. I haven't talked about the mechanics of play. This assumption that because you've come from your day job, and in your day job, you may know how to drive around a cruiser, great. But in the game, what are the rules for cruiser employment? It is a game. It is by definition an abstraction. And you may be no more ready to jump in and play the game than a bunch of real estate agents who are invited to a Monopoly tournament and think that, Monopoly, I heard it's about real estate. That's what I do for a living. I don't need to read the rules. And they're being eaten up by 14-year-olds who know the rules. So we spend a lot of time getting students ready to play. Now we can play. In this class, 6 different tactical problems were presented over the course of the year. You can see the first 2 were blue versus orange, different flavors, blue versus red. Remember, that's against the UK. The fourth one, blue versus red. This is the Battle of Sable Island. So basically, the Battle of Sable Island is what you do is you take the Battle of Jutland and you move it off of Halifax, Nova Scotia. And you take out the Germans and you stick in the Yanks. So you're fighting the Brits. And there's a potential invasion of Narragansett Bay, and this is all part of that. That's all tangled up in this Sable Island exercise. Exercise 4A and 4B were actually embedded as part of the ops problem 4. So there's a total of 75 days that are dealt with kind of that tactical level, often for the junior officers moving those little ships around on the floor. Now, interstitched with these, it's not like you played all the tactical games, then there were operational games. They're kind of they're interstitched between juniors and seniors and just the way the class is interweaved. But there were 4 operational problems that covered 128 days. Again, blue versus orange, commander's estimate for the first one. They don't actually play it out. They just work out doing the commander's estimate. They're constantly doing the commander's estimate, by the way. Nimitz complains at some point about every time I turn around, he's having to write these orders, having to do the commander's estimate. Yeah, but when you do it for a year, you get good at it. And every one of these estimates of the situation had the same parts, okay? And that's what's here in this little bubble right here. It had the same critical parts in terms of understanding the mission, opposing forces, enemy courses of action, your own course of actions, determining the best way forward, and final writing the directives to go forth and kill the enemy. All right, 128 days that it get to all of that. When all of that, now we're pushing towards the end of the course. One of the last items is a study of the Battle of Jutland. It's kind of done as a combo platter in terms of both. They don't replay the game in terms of, hey, one group of students are the Germans, another group of students are the English. It's played as kind of like a case study. We've got oral histories recorded by Frank McHugh, old wargamer who wrote on wargaming, fundamentals of wargaming. And he interviewed some of the folks that used to run the wargaming floor back in the day, the War College. And the staff that was responsible for the care and feeding of the models and the caring of the gaming facility hated the Battle of Jutland, because after the battle, on the floor, they would scribe the path of every ship. They would mark who was firing guns, torpedo paths. So at the end of the 8 days of discussing the Battle of Jutland, the floor is covered in wax pencil and crayon, which apparently was really hard to scrub off the floor. But again, Jutland is the battle to study in terms of it is the most recent major fleet action that we have to look at. And then finally, towards the tail end of these quick decision problems in the course, whereas before you might have a week dedicated to doing the estimate of the situation, 2 weeks dedicated to playing the game, another week in event. These are games that are more or less played off the cuff, a couple days, okay, just to quickly run through a couple of set piece problems. So this is the gaming, kind of a, the year in the life of a student and the sorts of gaming, the sorts of activities they were doing. Interspersed with these, the other 10% of the time were various presentations and lectures and guest speakers on naval tactics and topics of the day. But what's important to remember is where this lived. What's the broader environment of the War College and its relationship to other naval institutions? So understand that the War College was bringing in the best and brightest from the fleet. There is only one flag officer, okay, at the dawn of Pearl Harbor who is not a War College graduate. One. Right? So we're bringing in the best and brightest from the fleet. They're doing their year at the War College, and the graduates are either recycling back to become faculty and staying on board, going to one of the major bureaus. So we've got, again, at the time, we've got the Bureau of Aeronautics, the Bureau of Navigation, the gunnery side of the house, et cetera. So these are your major technology hubs, if you will. And or you've got graduates going to OpNav and the War Plans Division there. So having spent a year gaming at the college, you're going to go on and continue to game up at OpNav, or you're going back to the fleet and major fleet commands. So this knowledge gained on the floor of Pringle Hall, Loose Hall, Pringle Hall, eventually McCarty Little. But the knowledge that's being gained out there in the college is getting distributed through the fleet by the people we send forth. People are the conduits for this knowledge. People are the conduits for this giant shared understanding of the problem. What holds this whole picture together is the general board, my opinion. Right? So with the general board, right, because you had the CNO that sat the general board, you had the president of the Naval War College that sat on the naval board along with the chair, and there's a relationship here with the bureaus, the board, the OpNav, the fleet. There's a constant kind of feedback loops going on in terms of fleet problem reports are going back to OpNav. OpNav is turning around suggesting potential fleet problems for the fleet to work through. Fleet problem results often shape how we then update wargaming problems. Wargaming reports are going up to OpNav. OpNav is occasionally making suggestions for what they could, like, hey, could you throw this in a game for us? We're kind of batting around here. So there's this flow, not just similar to kind of like the cycle of research that Peter Perla talks about. It's part of this whole system. And the students, the graduates, are an important element of making this system work and disseminating this information. And we get to the point where either almost every naval officer knows either how to play wargaming, has an appreciation of wargaming, either because they were a student and did it, or they were faculty and taught it. And that's across the fleet. So War Plan Orange is less about the plan as it is the experience gained from a cadre of officers, right, who continually revisited this theater, continually thought about the logistics, continually thought about the geometry, the geography, the forces available throughout that time period. Remember I said, Nimitz is the class of 23. 23. I want you to think about the Navy in 1923 and what's going to be on the floor, okay, over in Loose Hall in 23 in terms of dreadnoughts and little biplanes, okay? That is not the Navy Nimitz fights with in 43. Yet, in his opening remarks at the start of this talk, he talks about the incredible value of wargaming by the people who did it. This generation of common understanding, of being able to think through problem sets, of having a shared awareness of the challenges the environment presented over decades of officers. As Miller says, it's more of a common understanding than it was about documents. No one opened up a safe, handed Nimitz a manila envelope with a great big wax seal on it and said, Godspeed, here's the plan. There was a collective understanding of what needed to be done. And I think it's this having the mental habits of mind, having this mental toolkit is what prevented Nimitz, here he is, student 54, is what prevented Nimitz from being completely surprised. It wasn't that he wasn't dealing with the unexpected, but that he had a way to deal with it because he had seen something like this before. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my perspectives on that. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator for Q&A.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Pete.
Yeah.
So we've got some great questions in already, and I would encourage the audience at large, if you have any outstanding questions that are rattling around in your brain, feel free to put those into the chat, and we'll start going through them here. And these are kind of came in chronologically, so they're kind of are going to adhere to those respective points in your presentation. But to start at the top, when you're talking about the personalities and their role in this process, what role did you talked a bit about the naval treaties? That's mentioned in this question, but what about budgets? Did that have any impact on some of the planning gaming at the time?
Not so much that I'm aware of. Okay, and again, I don't purport to be the expert on this time period. You know, I read a couple of books and I make a pretty presentation, so that's my credibility. But not that I've come across that. Yes, there was obviously budgetary issues in terms of Washington Treaty was applying pressure, and I got $1 to spend. It's a guns and butter arguments, and there is some of that budgetary pressure. I don't know that type of pressure then manifests in the way the students are gaming. Because again, the games tend to be about a tactical problem. And I tell you another significant thing about the games. I don't see a lot of evidence in the game records that we are trying to do out-year gaming. That we are doing, okay, so it's welcome class of 1923. We're going to game like it's 1935. I think they would have said, why? Right? This is a cadre of officers who, many of them were thinking, it's not a matter of if we fight, it's going to be a matter of when we fight. Right? We've got the world does not have a great track record in terms of not being at war. So these are very practical, real exercises. So it's less about trying to work through what should the future fleet architecture be, as it is, if I have to fight tomorrow, I need to know how to maneuver the force. If I have to fight tomorrow, I need to appreciate the risks that this imposes. Now, again, but it's not just the War College. Is this, that's it. Because you got people like Moffett. Right? Moffett takes some of the early experimentations and lessons as we screw around with naval aviation and aircraft carriers on the floor and takes them with him to the Bureau of Aeronautics and starts to think about fleet problems that involve Langley and feedback to the college. Hey, remember in that little combat result table that we had that we thought we could generate, so many sorties off the deck of Langley? Yeah, I'm here to tell you, it's about half that. That type of feedback and looping through and having people who understood wargaming involved in fleet problems. So there's some interesting stories about how there was this feeling at the time that some of the fleet problems were unduly constrained to make aviation look bad. And I think it's less about making aviation look bad. It was a problem that is always true when you go to sea. In terms of one of the differences between war games and exercises is this thing about using real troops, and real troops burn real money when they steam. Okay, so you have some real constraints that you have to deal with when you actually go to sea that you're free from in the wargaming environment. Hence why the Millennial Challenge is a great example of why you do not put together wargaming elements with actual fleet elements. But while the fleet certainly was wrestling with some budgetary issues and whatnot, and maybe some of that was feeding back into some of the options that were available or suggestions that OPNAV used to make to the college. I don't know that the college was particularly interested that I have come across. And again, haven't read every book on the interwar period at the War College. But I don't know that was particularly a powerful constraint on the schoolhouse. Anyways.
Excellent. So we actually have a couple questions now shifting to the Japanese perspective. So first, how was Japanese doctrine modeled after Mahan? Specifically, was there a decisive battle component to their doctrine? And if so, how did this affect not only the warplanes themselves, but then obviously our topic here, gaming?
Yep. So one of the things that I did not come across in any of the readings was any extensive effort to actually represent the Japanese tactics or strategies in the game. Remember, students played both sides of the equation. Students played blue, students played orange, or red, whoever the bad guy was. Students were playing both halves. Okay. Occasionally, instructors would for the purpose of demonstrating a particular principle. But so you have a ton of mirror imaging going on. Now, in some cases, the mirror imaging isn't that bad. Because a lot of senior Japanese naval officers study the United States. We're all reading the same text, we're all reading Mahan, and we're all kind of thinking that that's the approach. I don't know in terms of Japanese naval tactics of the period, and I'm sure there's people here who are far more studied in adversarial tactics World War II than I am. But I do know that we, on our side, made mistakes about thinking about how they were going to fight. And this is one of the things that goes into the value of gaming. Does gaming have to get everything exactly right? So we know that we got things like the long lance torpedo wrong. Okay, our rules for how far the Japanese torpedo would go were grossly underestimated. So we got that wrong. We got the Japanese night fighting capability wrong. They were way better at it, all right, than we thought. Conversely, they didn't use radar kind of the way we did, so they're potentially an advantage there. Submarine implementation. In many of the war games, the submarines are kind of in this escort role. They're sort of like underwater destroyers, and using them in independent operations against commerce, not what was gained. Okay? Landing operations, understood the necessity for it, did not have it gamed out in a lot of detail because we don't have the kit. It's not like we're pushing little mini LSTs around on the floor in that time period. So there's a lot of things we got wrong on our side of the equation in hindsight, looking at our rule sets and looking at how the war actually played out. I can't not think that there isn't a similar problem on the Japanese thinking side of the house. People often point to the gaming prior to Midway and the resurrection of the Navy carriers and stuff. And again, this is one of the things that I think most students of the period understand, that was one of those umpire overrules in terms of looking at, well, is that terribly plausible, or was that the one-off die roll, and let's press on. There were some important questions they could have asked themselves about, well, what if the Americans are here and not there, type of thing. But the fact that you would resurrect a ship in a war game is not a bizarre cheating, showing some sort of bizarre bias. We did it in our own war games often in terms of when we need to resurrect a ship because there's other objectives that need to be met. Now, we're very transparent when we do it. We document it pretty heavily about why we did it. But getting things wrong and understanding the other guy's doctrine and the necessity of getting all that right and the most realistic possible, I think is overrated, right? And in terms of oftentimes then we let that get in the way of just gaming and play and developing those analytic skills to be able to analyze, think about, and decide. And sometimes you're going to get it right in terms of the way the adversary behaves. And a lot of times you're going to get it wrong, but that's not the point. So I haven't looked a whole lot, and I know other people have looked at, like, how take World War II. Remember when Peter Perlo talked about this in terms of gaming on the German side or World War II and stuff. Everyone's got their mechanisms, but it's all about trying to train. My view, it's all about trying to train the fighter and giving him those habits of mind. McCarty Little wrote this in terms of being able to do the right thing at the right time, even when you're under pressure and people are shooting at you. That only comes through practice, and the best way to practice this isn't working.
Excellent. And kind of tangentially related to that, another question is, how informed was the Imperial Japanese Navy about U.S. war planning? Specifically, were they aware of the color plans?
Yeah, I have no idea. If someone's got an answer, throw it in the chat. I have not read anything where they were like, oh, the Americans are over there doing that wargaming. Now, the fact that we're wargaming, I'm pretty sure everyone was aware of. You look at some of our old the old engravings that showed up in with Harper's Weekly. It was a popular magazine of the late 1800s, and they had pictures of the War College and people playing war games. Wargaming is not some niche thing in America. Good heavens, it's obviously it starts in Germany. McCarty Little, when McCarty Little in his relationship with Livermore, William Livermore in the Army side of the house, is kind of what brings it to the War College. But a lot of this is we're borrowing from other people. Fred Jane, there's a part in our own wargaming books where it says that our early rules for wargaming were meant for simplicity and ease of play. They were not meant to make anything that's manifestly possible in the water impossible, nor was it allowed to make the possible that which you could not do on the water. But if you want a more detailed study, play Fred Jane's game. We endorse Fred Jane's game. So, lots of people are wargaming. I can't believe that they weren't all generally aware of the fact that we were probably wargaming against them. But then again, we were wargaming against the Brits. Anyone really think we're going to go fight with the Brits? We were wargaming against the Brits because they were the kid to beat. That was the premier Navy to beat. If you can beat them, you can beat anybody.
It's funny you mentioned that. That's actually kind of the next question here. We have a few folks. In fact, we have one individual mentioned, an audience member mentioned they're from the UK, and was curious about was Red, to what extent was Red played out in wargaming? And beyond that, when did War Plan Red stop being played out? When did that seem to be not a concern? So again, this is the difference between when we talk about War Plan Orange and playing the orange adversary in a war game, it's not synonymous. So War Plan Orange, a thing held by OPNAV, playing against the Orange, Japan, as a curriculum activity to learn how to deal with that particular adversary and that particular geography, and as well as looking at what the British Navy, again, I just said British Navy was like the benchmark, right? They were the ones to beat, right? And prior to about 1920, 1920, 21, right in that time period, basically after World War I, okay, up to that point,
our rules for wargaming didn't really distinguish one guy's Navy from another guy's Navy, right? It was more about ship classes. So an American dreadnought was equal to a British dreadnought, was equal to a French dreadnought, was equal to a German dreadnought. A dreadnought's a dreadnought. It doesn't matter who operates it. Okay, these are the rules for a dreadnought. Like, yeah, big, stick it on the floor. So many degrees per minute, how fast it goes. Ditto destroyers, ditto cruisers, etc. It's about the ship class, not about the country. After World War I, we start going, They're looking at Jutland, going, we need to revise our rules. Maybe German kit is different than British kit, is different than American kit. And we should reflect those capabilities in our rule sets. Of course, it means the rules expand in size. And now we get into these really long turns because we got a lot of detail now and we're worried about plunging fire versus flat fire and armor. And there's a lot more detail that goes into it. And that kind of drags things out. So red remains an adversary. Great Britain remains an adversary for play purposes all the way up to the start of the war. Now, when does war plan red fall off of things? I don't know. All right, that again, the war plans were held by OPNAV, and I don't know how much was seriously planned against anymore from a nation perspective. Like, we're likely to go to war with the United Kingdom. But as far as you want a tough kid to try to show your chops on the wargaming floor, beat the Royal Navy, and you're somebody.
So continuing on that issue of the division between OPNAV and the War College, what was OPNAV's response to the papers forwarded to it from the Naval War College between 1919 and 1941 that you kind of discussed?
It's not clear to me. I would recommend in this dance between OPNAV, the fleet problems, the War College, and the bureaus, and through the General Board, two other authors, Al Nafis to Train the Fleet, okay, and John Kuhn's Agents of Innovation, to get a good understanding of that. We have some cases where we know from correspondence, but it's correspondence, it's personal letters being written back and forth between OPNAV and like the Chief of Naval Operations and the President of the Naval War College, that some of the stuff was taken on very interestingly. It was like, oh, that's interesting. And it would be forwarded out for a fleet experimentation potentially. And then the results would flow back. But it's all very loose, in terms of, it wasn't like on every third Thursday, we sent up a batch of papers and then they would be a formal response to them that I can find. I get the impression that in this time period, it's very much so about personalities, individuals, and kind of an informal relationship. And again, we're all of the same ilk, right? Because we've all come through the War College. We've all ended up in all those different places I had in that one picture. So I think that goes a long ways to carrying around the information. OPNAV doesn't have to wait for a paper. They have the kid who played it on staff now, type of thing. And so a lot of this knowledge kind of gets embedded that way, and it's less of explicit knowledge because it's captured in writings and formal doctrine, as it is just a professional naval officer's catalog of knowledge that they're all sharing. So I don't know the specific cases where the OPNAV kind of would say, yeah, thanks for that, but we're not interested. Or they went, well, that's fascinating. Again, I do know that there was some times where OPNAV was asking the War College, hey, what do you think about X? Because we did have that, we had good wargaming facilities. We had trained faculty. We had a lot of respected officers on the course, both faculty and students coming through. So OPNAV felt free, again, after we get through the nastiness of, thank you for interest in national affairs, and we're kind of back together, we've kissed and made up, that there is some direction coming down from OPNAV asking the War College to do stuff in terms of, hey, take a look at this. What do you think about this? This college then turning around and sending those reports back up to OPNAV, and then what happens? I don't know. I can only assume that, again, in that larger ecosystem, that was a net positive across the system, if you will, because of all those organizations having that underpinning of a cadre of officers similarly trained and understood similar problems, having experienced it on the floor of Loos, Pringle, etc.
So looking at this topic more in general, in your research, are there any books or sources on the Rainbow War Plans that you would really highlight for anybody that wants to explore the topic further?
Not for me on the Rainbow side, because my interest, I don't say my interest drops off dramatically once the war starts, but my interest was the interwar period. And by the time we get to the Rainbow Plans, we're on the cusp of war. And so I haven't looked at those as in much detail. But it's the folks that are here. If someone wants to chuck recommendations into the chat for me, because like I said, I tend to be more focused on the pre-war period. I'd just be making up stuff. I will say that if you do read Ed Miller's book, War Plan Orange, there is a section where he talks about gamers at war, and then kind of that. Okay, so here's what we thought on the run up to war, and now we've got all these officers that are trained over a 20-year period, and now we go to war. What's the contrast? I mean, that's in part of Nimitz's comments. But specific to the rainbow plans, I would defer to somebody else to give a good recommendation.
Well, and piggybacking on that answer, I would add to the audience, if you're not tracking the chat, as usual, we have a very engaged audience, as seems to be the norm for our webinars, and there are lots of folks throwing around different sources, books, etc., pertaining to this topic. So another kind of interesting question. Any records, are there any records kept of how many times main players, especially those with recognizable names such as Nimitz, that they would have, like, their wins or losses or any sort of record keeping of their specific wargaming experience at the War College during their time there?
Yeah, so individuals, not that I'm aware of. We've seen the tactics office, and I do a separate little talk about how the wargaming department, it wasn't like we were always a department, separate group. College established in 1884, wargaming pretty much so marks it started in 1887, but we weren't a separate organization within the college until way much later, until you start pushing into the 70s. Otherwise, remember, it's just how we teach. But in the 30s, we know that Captain Van Auken, who was part of the tactics office, did try to start doing some cross-game analysis in terms of, hey, let's look back over the last couple of 4 or 5 games here. And start looking at basically tonnage sunk type of things and seeing if you could find trends. That's at a game level, not at an individual student level. There are stories, and I'll relate this one about Ernie King, about the value of games to individuals. And then some authors have suggested that gaming could be intensely personal and could also be intensely beneficial or hazardous to your career. And we talk about, remember, better to fail on the floor of the war game than fail in real life. Well, careful, don't fail too bad, right? Because somebody might be thinking, oh my God, he can't drive 10 ships around. Why would I give him a real ship? Ernie King, class of 33. And he's coming up on one of the ops problems, all right? And they want him to do the Northern Pacific problem, all right? That's kind of like the next in the curriculum. Okay, you're gonna do the Northern Pacific problem, and it's your turn to be, blue lead. And King goes, the Northern Pacific one is stupid. Right? That is not tactically, strategically sound. I would rather play out either the Central or Southern Pacific routes to Japan if I'm going to be in charge. And I said, well, Captain King, noted. However, the curriculum calls for this particular ops plan for the next event. Yeah, I don't want to do it. It's like, well, okay, then I'm sure we can find another student who will be ready to step into the blue lead's shoes. And Ernie went, oh, okay, hang on, sorry. I'm not about to give up my spot to be in command, right? I'll take order, well, paraphrasing, I'll take orders from a wash cook, right, before I give up my chance to command in the games. It was seen as incredibly important to demonstrate your leadership and to get those experiences in the games. So I know that individual officers put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform well in those games. And so, again, how well did Nimitz do? I mean, a more contemporary story we like to tell is when Admiral Scott Swift was wargaming with us at the college. And one of his war games, it was what we call the do-over game, where you fight till about midweek, and we get to do this whole stop, because when you play a game, you go, if I had that do over again, I wouldn't have done X or Y. Or now that I played the game, I know better, I'm going to do the Z instead. And so we gave him a do-over point because he had lost a couple of carriers at this point in this conflict. And he's like, okay, I got it. I know exactly what Red's going to do the next turn. They took a break again midweek. They were able to re-wicker their fleet a bit, add some different capabilities, and come back on. And in round 2, he lost more carriers than he did in round 1. Didn't stop his promotion process. All right. He was a rare officer who was willing to put himself out there and risk not being embarrassed, but risk tactical defeat on the floor to understand operational problems to a greater depth. He said, the war games never told me how to go about fighting LCS, but what it taught me was that when next time I talk to my surface commanders, I'll be able to ask more intelligent questions. Good war game raises more questions than it answers, but makes you a sharper commander for understanding what your subordinates are struggling with. That was always his approach to gaming. I can't imagine it was terribly different in the interwar period.
So one thing I was thinking about in terms of differences between the interwar period and the evolution, as you describe it, and the war itself is kind of this elephant in the room of the Marine Corps. And that leads me to the question, what was the role of the Marine Corps in the wargaming happening at the Naval War College during this interwar period?
Yeah, there was a recognition that somebody was going to have to be taking these islands, all right, that we're talking about. And landing operations were gamed. Now, they weren't gamed at a high level of tactical detail, simply because the tactics were still being formed. The technology wasn't there in terms of, okay, different types of landing ships and whatnot. And the other piece that just jumped out of the Marines, and the Seabees. The Seabees were another important part of the puzzle, right? Because in all of these things, we're starting thinking about, okay, so we got a couple of options as we go charging across the Pacific. And when it comes to these islands, we're either taking islands that the Japanese already had, and on that island, they are the ones who already built a pier, an airfield, and they got something we can take, and they didn't wreck it. Either we didn't wreck it, taking it from them, or they didn't destroy it as on their way out, or we're taking places where there's nothing to start off with, and we're going to have to create this expeditionary airfield. Okay, so the Seabees are an important part of the infrastructure understanding about how we're going to have to build. And did we play games with the Seabees in terms of how long does it take to lay march the matting and create an airfield? I don't know. I don't think so. And likewise, while we may have recognized the necessity to take an island, did we game through the landing operation beyond naval support and air support for the operation, and then figure out, okay, so how long is it going to take? How long is it going to take to take Iwo Jima? I don't know of any games that were that specific in terms of ground operations on the islands. They recognized from the ops games that they needed to take the islands, but don't know that at the time we had worked through the details of how to do that. That's still all developing. And the War College isn't necessarily the place to develop those tactics per se. Doesn't mean that we weren't trying to incorporate them coming out of fleet exercises, coming out of OPNAV and other agencies. But I don't think I can't say that somehow we were in the lead of developing those. We recognize certainly the necessity for them, but I don't know of any gaming where we were gaming out a Guadalcanal, gaming out Okinawa, Iwo Jima, et cetera.
So looking at the overall impact of wargaming in this period on the naval force, given that things moved far slower in that time period, it's certainly reasonable to see how these lessons from the Naval War College sank into the ethos of the force. But considering that today's world, in contrast, changes so quickly, do you see this approach as still working, or what kind of, I guess, to that notion, what kind of constraints do you see that are unique to this time period relative to that of the interwar period?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my comment earlier about getting all wrapped up in realism and understanding that the definition of wargaming that we use at the college, Frank McHugh's definition, is about a conflict played within a set of rules that is either for the purpose of getting decision-making experience, play the game so that you learn how to make decisions under different circumstances, or the other side of his little diagram is gaining information to support decisions, informational decisions, so analytics, education, but they both have to come together at the bottom where it says, and is relevant to real world situations. Relevant, not realistic, but relevant. Now, how do you get relevancy? Well, I guess by being realistic, that's a way to do it. But I think that's something you'll constantly chase after and never get there. So worry less about the pace of technology changes, worry less about the specifics, and develop a cadre of officers who know how to play. Play engenders analytic thinking then engenders an understanding of the situation, which you can then use leadership to enact action towards. So I look at my own kids, and there was a Wall Street journalist who wrote a lengthy article about the value of play for her kids and all of the skills that her kids have because they played games in terms of poise, being able to do things like the intelligent down select, all right, and guessing. All of these activities she can attribute back to practice in a play environment. Play games. That's why I tell people about about learning how to be a designer or being a better warrior. Play games. The skill sets that are imparted through gameplay are easily transferable to other problem sets. It does not have to be this high degree, again, this idea that we're all going to put on VR goggles and wear funky suits and we're going to run around on the holodeck, right? I'm trying to get, and this again, the arguments between training versus education, but I would rather see a cadre of officers who have been playing games and have developed the habits of mind to be able to address whatever comes at them. Because I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to get it wrong. Okay? We always get it wrong in terms of the details and the specifics. I want to see us at least then put forth a cadre of officers who can handle that ambiguity. And you get that ambiguity through playing games. Right? This is my faux Rudyard Kipling. The Navy is made of sailors and stuff. The stuff will rust. It's the sailors I trust. That's what I need to put out there. I need to put out there trained officers who are educated officers who can take on that Nimitz. I'm not surprised. I may not have expected that, but I'm not on the back foot now either. I have the skill sets to be able to analyze the situation and put forth a course of action because I got a chance to practice it playing games. That's why I won't worry about the pace of technology changes, because I'm not gaming the specific technologies. Yes, that's part of the environment, but I want guys who can handle any environment, because I'm telling you right now, I'm getting it wrong. The wars we keep thinking we're going to fight, wrong. The wars we end up fighting, didn't see coming. Okay, I need a guy who can handle both. You can't sit back and go, well, you can't blame me for not performing. That's not a game that wasn't a war that I was prepared for. I don't think we're going to take that excuse. Likewise, when we talk about the Navy kit we give them, we're spending an awful lot of time trying to educate senior officers to understand the value of wargaming to inform their decisions. Most of these officers, and this is my personal opinion, this is not the opinion of the Naval War College, my personal opinion is that we spend an awful lot of energy educating officers to appreciate war games. These officers are closer to retirement age than fighting age. And yet we're trying to convince them that our war games are telling them something so that they can procure kit that they're then going to give to a generation of officers behind them. And they're going to be expected to fight and win with whatever kit they got. And those officers never got a chance to wargame. That's a problem.
And so a natural transition from this discussion about the institutional importance of wargaming, how do we build the ecosystem of educational wargaming present during the interwar period for today's Department of Navy, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know. That's my quick answer. It starts off, I think, with the individual schools, and I know that we had a joint, the J7 is looking at the JPME, Joint Professional Military Education. Are we achieving what we set out to achieve with JPME, phase 1, phase 2 education, joint officers, et cetera? And the answer seems to be no, we're not. Some people have pointed out that while especially with the war colleges, that we had the opportunity to be first-rate professional military academies. And I believe I'm quoting Jim Lacey here. Instead, they chose to be second-rate community colleges. All right, again, personal opinions. All right, in terms of where we put our focus. Remember what I said before, 90% of the curriculum was spent wargaming and preparing for war. Now, Spruance, when he came back from World War II, said, gee, I wish I had more and more of that poli-sci stuff. Now, he didn't say at the expense of the warfighting part of the curriculum, but unfortunately, the curriculums have become shorter, and there's a whole separate discussion we could have in terms of the fate of military colleges, Army, Air Force, Navy. As we came out of World War II, the experiences of Vietnam and how that shaped colleges, the changes in the demographics, the prioritization for who went to schools, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the schools now are a shadow of their former selves. When I've given this talk about the interwar period and the college, and I do this walking tour where we walk around the college, and I kind of basically take the history of wargaming through the buildings that it was done in, and we kind of move from the Founders Hall, the first building, through Luce Hall and Pringle Hall and Sims Hall and to McCarty Little. And I give this whole talk about the campus and the wargaming that went on at the campus and the gaming that's going on at McCarty Little. And I'm doing this for one of our joint military ops seminars. And I give the interwar period talk, and I always get the question. So they're kind of like getting liquored up because I think, oh, so when are we going to play all these games? And it says, you're not. You're not. It's not the way the curriculum is scheduled, it's structured anymore. the first time I gave this talk, and again, I just read Ed Miller's book and a couple other books, and I was just trying to make myself smarter about this time period everybody kind of went on about and got all dewy-eyed when they said the interwar period. So as I was reading the book and kind of put together my first brief, I got invited to present it to the president of the Naval War College at the time, Admiral P. Gardner Howe. And okay, sure, I'm just giving you a glorified book report, okay? So I give my glorified book report. And I started getting grilled by some of the academics in the room, like I'm doing my PhD defense. And it took me, I got caught on the back foot and I couldn't figure out why I was getting so beat up about this. And I realized only in hindsight, sometime later, that in illustrating the interwar period and talking about the curriculum that was game-centric, warfighting-centric, that's a threat to the more the security environment and some of the other parts of the curriculum, which have been introduced to most of the war colleges in part for accreditation, to be able to award a master's. And I was seen as a troglodyte, recommending that we go back to the old days and play the way we did back then, and the curriculum should reflect that, and we can get rid of all these poli-sci people. And I didn't appreciate that at the time. And I know there's been some discussions going on about how do we change the curriculum to include more gaming, because of just the power of gaming, to improve the officer going out the front door. And I know Jim Lacey's been involved with conversations for the Marine Corps University. I'm not really fully sure what conversations we may be having at the Naval War College. I think the Army's had some conversations around this. Other institutions have had better luck introducing gaming back into the curriculum. It seems to be an uphill fight, to be quite honest, in terms of making changes to the curriculum to introduce elements, pieces, parts of what we used to do. Are we going to go back to 90% of all instructional, go back to almost the full 270 some days and 90% of it's going to be spent wargaming? Are we going to get back to that? I don't think so. Is that the right answer or not? I don't know. I'm a pro wargaming for education purposes kind of guy, and that's how I tend to see the world. And I like to see everybody playing more war games, but I don't know that we're going to get there necessarily. There are indications that we need to move in that direction. Again, we'll see how it goes.
So taking this a step further, and you've already touched on a few of these matters, but can you lay out the reasons and timeline of the decline of wargaming at the War College, the Navy's growing disinterest in wargaming, and the loss of wargaming competence within the Navy at large?
Yeah, so interesting. I've just started looking at this a little bit more, so I don't fully informed thoughts here, but it's some pieces, parts I've recently read. And there was a paper written by Captain Hurlburt, who I want to say was the first director of the Center for Advanced Research, the predecessor for the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, which is what the wargaming is part of at the Naval War College. And he was looking at gaming from 1969 to 1989. And a couple of factors seem to be pretty dominant in the demise of wargaming, at least from his perspective. Having been a student in 69 and 70, and then also then being in a leadership position at the War College. So a couple things. First, nuclear weapons didn't help, okay? In terms of, well, if all you need to do, there's no tactical finesse in the use of nuclear weapons at sea. Okay, you've seen the pictures of the Bikini Atoll and the great big dome of water and all the little tiny ships out there. Close is close enough, and so the necessity of the kind of the tactical level of study of the application of naval power that was going on at the War College seemed to be kind of moot with nukes. Now, of course, remember that this is how the whole thing was going to go, right? If you weren't delivering a nuke, you were irrelevant in the post-World War II world. Hence why we had the A3D off the aircraft carriers, heavy bomber that could deliver a nuke. Okay, obviously the Tridents, the nuclear triad, and it's all about throwing a nuke. And if you're not part of the nuke game, you're not going to get funded. Right? Of course, then Korea and Vietnam demonstrate that we're not going to turn every war into a nuclear war. But that put a chilling effect on wargaming, and the necessity to do so also was started to put a chilling effect on the game in this perverse way was the introduction of the computer. We talk about when we got news, the Naval Electronic Warfare System, and then the NWIGs, the enhanced system, et cetera, as we moved into computer gaming. Apparently, at least again, this is Captain Hurlburt's view, and it's backed up with some of the things that Admiral Turner did in the 70s in terms of computers became the thing. The computer was the oracle. A computer put a man on the moon. So why can't a computer we'll just run combat simulations and we'll run them over and over again, and we'll figure out the best way to win. all hail the computer. And so computer and war simulation became the hot thing, and not computers to support war gaming. Lots of problems. The interfaces were clumsy. We still use them. They were crucial for distributing war gaming, being able to do more with computer networks. But this idea that it's all about computer simulation, that's the value, is using the computer, fight the computer. And in the class of 1969, 1970, remember before I told you how many days, 245 days of gaming? The class of 60, the class of 70, started in 69, had 20 days of gaming in the curriculum. The other time on the computer, this is using the Enhanced Naval Wargaming system. The rest of the time was allocated to fleet gaming. So again, this is like coming to the Oracle, coming to the great computer, and you've got to schedule time on the great computer for the Oracle to tell you how your naval battle is going to go. And the students got 20 days worth, the fleet got 30 days worth. I don't have the rest of the year, but those are the time allocations. So the necessity to do it seemed to be diminished. The computer seemed to be taking the place of doing gaming. There were some people have postulated that the change in who went to the war colleges and the tempo post-Vietnam was such that, after we went from Vietnam, straight into Korea, straight into Vietnam, didn't leave much breathing time in there for the fleet. And so we stopped sending people the same type of numbers to the war colleges. And that had an impact then on downstream about how many officers have been trained. I have a separate study where I've looked at the number of 4-star admirals and chiefs of naval operation who are war college graduates over time. And at World War II, up through World War II, the vast majority of chiefs of naval operation are either graduates or faculty, or never both, of the war college. After World War II, all the numbers flip upside down. The minority of 4-stars, the minority of CNOs are graduates of the war college. I think this represented, again, a shifting of priorities. And there's more there. I know other authors have picked at this thing about the demise of the war colleges post-World War II. It's not just the Navy that suffered, and some of the underlying reasons. But I know from Hurlburt's perspective, from 69 to 89, it wasn't until the CNO, I want to say it was Hayward, said, hey, this big old computer system of yours, how about we use it to see what a global war against the Soviet Union would look like? Ooh, those are the globals. Those are the early globals, the late 70s and or 80s and then through the 90s. Two problems. One, not problem, but one, so CNO wants to run a global war game. And we've started this mid-year accession problem with the war college and students. It used to be you got all your students in the fall, they graduated in the spring, they went away, new assignments over the summer. Then we started doing these mid-years where we take people in as a new class, and we started the new class in like January. It's like, well, they're going to have to summer over and finish in the fall of that year. What do we do with them in the summer? I know what we do with them. We make them a part of an advanced research project called the GARP, the Global Advanced Research Project, which supported these giant games looking at worldwide conflict with the Soviet Union. That became the game, the globals. And various authors have written, Barney Rubel, but hey, have written about the global years, especially of the 80s and 90s. And eventually those got so big and cumbersome that in some ways they collapsed under their own weight. And they weren't seen as much value anymore. It didn't help the Soviet Union collapse, and they were the primary adversary of that type of game. So there's a couple of different causes in there that seems to influence the demise. Again, the shift towards accreditation, towards being more multidisciplinary, the unwillingness to expand the curriculum in terms of number of days in the curriculum to be able to cover all this material. I'm trying to fit this in an officer's rotation. The Navy has always had this attitude that, sailors belong at ships, ships belong at sea. Education is fine as long as you do it in your own time. Again, my personal opinion, a little pejorative, all right? But it's never been historically as valued like it has been in some other services in terms of necessary stepping stone to promotion. So again, all those dynamics I think have diluted some of the power, and we're in a period of retrospective now, a kind of reflection and an opportunity to kind of look at the curriculums and see what we're doing and seeing if we can both leverage both technology improvements as well as gaming. But I don't want technology improvement to become, we just need to find the best computer game we can to play. Somehow I got a group of officers, Nimitz, Turner, Halsey, King, that figured out how to fight a global conflict by playing with tin ships on a floor. So let's not oversell a computer.
So with that, I think we'll move into our final question. I think that kind of wraps this up nicely, puts a good bow on it. And that is simply, what lessons do you think we can leverage for educational wargaming from the Naval War College Interwar Wargames?
All right, so, okay, let me just talk about, and let me just not point at the interwar period. So, well, first and foremost, do it, okay? You've got to do it. And if anything, in the interwar period, it showed that not just the, a course in it, do it for a semester. I mean, they did it the entire year. They did it over and over and over again. And they give multiple opportunities for multiple officers to experience the challenges of command in that environment. Now, that said, a powerful tool in building your analytic appreciation for any situation, whether we're talking about a war situation or we're talking about, I don't know, how you survive a plane crash in the Andes, is to design games. Right? Phil Sabins, all right, to simulate war, is an excellent understanding and approach in terms of not only is it about playing games, although if I just have everybody playing games, I'm happy. It's also about developing ways to, you're developing those design skills, because in being a game designer, and I work with a lot of schools that use game design as an education activity unto itself, because when you design a game, you've got to be able to do the research and distill the relevant pieces parts out of it, a complex web of cause and effect that represents a conflict, and be able to kind of figure out what are the most salient parts to pick out of that pattern, and how do those pieces parts relate to one another, and how do I distill the essence of tank conflict in the Eastern Front, how do I distill the essence of a defense of the Panama Canal. I can't replicate, I'm not going to try to reproduce in every detail, but I've got to figure out what are the most salient ones. Why do I think those are the most salient ones? You're doing a high level degree activity, mental activity, in trying to find the strongest governing factors which are influencing an event. And learning how to design games around that is a powerful educational tool to understand a situation, to understand the relevant forces that shape a player's or a person's decisions in those sorts of situations. I've had kids come back from, asked to do senior projects for graduation requirement in the state of Rhode Island. And they'll want to do a game design, and I'll end up being a mentor. And initially, teachers are reluctant to let them do a game. It seems like they're goofing off, they're playing. And I try to explain to them the research, the writing, the high level thinking. They're going to use any type of combat. They're going to have to understand probability and statistics. So I got the math department involved. I got the English department involved because they're going to have to write rules. I got the visual arts being applied. All you people who dropped out of art, all right, in the 8th grade and didn't take it in high school, shame on you, because what you dropped out of was learning how to visually communicate in a visual world. Okay, that's all part of game design. You get all that stuff going. I think, and as a matter of fact, we got Mikey Markowitz who's going to be talking about visualization of war games here coming up. Design them, play them, and do it as often as you can. That's always my direction to the fleet. Design them, play them as often as you can.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Pete. I mean, just speaking for myself, I really enjoyed this presentation, and looking at the engagement of our audience and how many folks we had here this evening, I think that they all share the same sentiment. So for our audience at large here, this webinar, as well as all our previous webinars, are going to be up on our YouTube channel. I will put that in the chat here momentarily. Additionally, I'll throw our website in there in case some of you aren't familiar with it. That'll have all of our future events that you can register for. Our next event is February 23rd, which will be Why Games Work, Role-Playing Games and Simulations as an Educational Tool, hosted by Jared Fishman. And with that, Pete, do you have any final words?
I'm just going to put a plug in for the next one about role-playing games. This is a time when I teach one of the wargaming courses, I ask about people's what are their gaming experiences, and I ask about who are the D&D players, all right? Because it used to be D&D players, you were the nerds, okay? You hid in closets. You didn't want to announce your D&D cred, okay? And I point out to people that role players, people who can put themselves in the shoes of another and see the world through a different set of eyes, are the world's best lawyers, negotiators, politicians, statesmen, and warriors. So role play, phenomenally important, another good skill to develop.